daktek l'shalem rak kishigomar hanesiya. So we had seen that there's an opinion that says that you should only pay at the end of the trip when you take your cab. And this is a machlokes. He brings in the footnotes that there's no reason, if you want to pay in advance, you have every right to pay in advance. You just don't have an obligation to pay until the very end. Okay. So that's what we had seen from the Likutim. Let me just see if there's anything else here in the Likutim. I don't believe so. Right. So just to take a quick look at some of the biurim. There's a lot of biurim here. Well, let's see if there's anything. Let's see. Not here.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Someone asked me a question. They said that they're going to a school here in Toronto, a Hebrew school in Toronto here, and midway during the year, they moved down to Florida, and they were paying on a month-to-month basis their tuition obligations. So when they moved to Florida,
did they give head checks? Is that usually what happens?
Probably.
Yeah.
So the question was, were they responsible for paying for the last 2-3 months to the school here? And because they're going to have to pay for the school down in Florida as well.
Right.
I was trying to compare it to the rent agreement, whether or not the person paid in advance or he's going to pay at the end and he just pays for the time that he was there. And if he paid in advance, he'd have,
yeah. So there's a lot of there are similarities, but we also have to be aware of the dissimilarities as well. When a school, let's say, has a maximum occupancy of, let's say, 25 children per class, and many schools are in high demand, and so they have to turn away some students. If someone takes one of those spots and then leaves in the middle of the year, the school might have a valid a complaint that we made room for your child at the expense of other children, and now that you're pulling out, you're leaving us in the middle of the year without that space and without that revenue to cover the costs of educating the other 24 children. So, I in the case of the rent, we had said that it's a machlokes in the poskim whether if you pull out after a week, right, when it's a 2-week rental, whether you have a chiyuv to pay for that second week. It's a machlokes in the poskim, right? And some say yes, some say no. But one of the arguments to permit a person to pull out is that the landlord could always find another tenant. But in a situation where the landlord cannot find another tenant because of the scenario, then I think that it's not as clear cut that a person can say, well, I'm going to side with those poskim that I don't have to pay. I don't have to pay. So I would like to keep that question in the back of your head, Shmuel, because maybe we'll see some more cases as we go along in this siman that might allow us to address that a little bit better. Okay, so sure. So let's take a look. Just something he says in the biurim over here. Kodem halayla, you've got to give them their wages before nightfall. V'yesh lihistapek k'sha'adam hizmin ba'al melacha kagon instaltor, which I think is a plumber, sheyiftach stima b'tzaneret, who can unclog a pipe. I don't know. Is anyone familiar with that word instaltor? How do they say plumber in Hebrew? Wayne, you probably would know. Probably have had to deal with a plumber at least once since you made Aliyah.
I think they call it plumber.
All right, let me the
Although if they were greeners, they might say plumber, because I remember that growing up.
Okay, so a plumber is a sharav rav. But
So I
there's
just
another,
looked up.
but there's another word.
Installator on Google, and it says plumber.
Installator.
Installator. It says plumber.
Installator. Installator is a plumber. Okay, great. So you hire a plumber to unclog your pipe. Below sikemi mo merosh al mechir. You didn't set the price when you first called him. L'achar gemar hamalacha dorish meimo habal malacha sikum misuyam kagon matayim shekel. So at the end of the job, the plumber says, "Okay, here's the bill. It's 200 shekel." Okay, the habalabayis. This is now written close to 30, 40 years ago. I'm not sure how much 200 shekels was worth, but it was probably more than what it's worth today. The balabas is skeptical whether he really deserves that amount. And he thinks he might be getting ripped off. And so the balabas, which is a bit of a chutzpah for the balabas to say, I don't think you deserve 200 shekel. So, but okay, he says, I'm giving you 100 shekel for sure. I owe you. But I want to do my own inquiry to make sure that you deserve that extra 100 shekel. In other words, I want to get some comps about what other plumbers would charge before I'm going to be prepared to pay you. That sounds like you're ripping me off, man. And the plumber says, "Sir, you owe me 200 shekels." Well, he doesn't say "sir," but he says, "You owe me 200 shekels." Here in Canada, the guy would say, "Sir, you owe me $200. Sorry." Right? And you owe me this. You owe me this money, and I don't. I'm not giving you a discount. Litain lo kol dorish shelo yavar al bal tolin titain scharo. So now the question becomes like this. It's a very straightforward issue. You said you tell me what I owe you. I think you're ripping me off. I don't want to be over on bal tolin about not paying you at the end of a job before sunset. So I have the havi sveika de oraisa, and it's a suffix on a de oraisa mitzvah. Because maybe he does deserve this amount. Or maybe no. Maybe you could say that in the event that the guy is ripping me off, then really he doesn't have the right to charge me that amount. And so it's a suffix mama. It's a suffix whether I owe you money or not. And anytime we say that there's a suffix whether I owe you money or not, the person who's the muhzak, who's holding on to the money, is allowed to continue to hold on to the money until they go to a din Torah and verify the facts. The imhu yitain lokei says hakol, and the balabas is therefore worried that if I pay you the full amount, he's worried that maybe I won't be able to get it back from you. Maybe you won't go to Beis Din. Maybe I'll will fall off the face of the earth. And I'll have to run after you, and it's going to be an inconvenience. So he says, so he says, before we explain this issue, he says, first of all, we need to clarify something very, very important at the outset. When a person comes to work for me, and we have not set a fixed price yet for what I have to pay that person, my obligation as an employer is only to pay the person minimum wage. If we haven't set a price on what I owe you, so you can charge me for your the materials. But as far as what I pay you per hour, since we haven't fixed the price, I only have to pay you minimum. Now, minimum pachosh b'polim doesn't necessarily mean minimum wage, period. It could be minimum wage that plumbers get. But there's a plumbers union. Is there a plumbers union? I have no idea. But yeah, okay. Va'afilu im yitbarer derubam dorshim avor malacha zu 200 shekel mikol makom miutam lokchim rak 100 ein tzarich litein lo yoter. And even if the majority of plumbers would take 200 for that job, but there's a minority who would take 100, then I'm not obligated to pay you more than what some plumbers would get compensated. And this is brought down, he's quoting the Rif and the Shita Mekubetzes, in the name of the Ritva and the Shulchan Aruch and the Ktsos HaChoshen, etc., etc. V'hinei mitzad echad matzinu d'chiyuv tashlum b'yomo l'poel mutal ala ba'al habayis gam b'makom safek. So, second point is that he says, we know that even when there's a suffix as to whether the fellow has to pay or not, the employer still has an obligation to pay in order to avoid the prohibition of bal tolling. And how do I know this? The ayin be'erich shai, shekasa b'zel shama nirali kaven de biyomo titain scharo asay. He says, since there's a biblical positive commandment to pay him his wages on time, because of b'chavos das dehecha de Torah amra kum asay sarich sheyitkayem ha'asay bevadai. In all cases, you have to make sure that you definitively fulfill the positive commandment. Ve'im safek niskayem habilu chumra, the lashon haTorah al havadai. He says, and if you're not sure whether you did it or not, you have to be machmir. Whereas when it comes to a masha'en kein lo saseh, when it comes to a negative commandment, and we're going to skip the parentheses, where basically the point is, there we don't say that there we don't say that you have to verify whether or not you were over on the lo saseh and be machmir. Okay, v'im kain, but certainly for a mitzvah saseh. V'im kain yesh lomar nehi desafei gezel ein tzarich lahachzir. The gezel vaday omer rachmana de lo tigzal avol b'schar schir b'yomo titein scharo vaday. So he says, therefore, let's say there's a doubt as to whether I've stolen or not. And I now am being told I've stolen and I have to give back the money. But it's not clear that I've stolen. Maybe I did steal, maybe I didn't steal. So then the burden of proof is on the person who says that I have stolen in order to be obligated to return what I'm accused of. But when it comes to a positive mitzvah of give him his wages at the proper time, I have to be machmir that even if there's a suffix that I haven't done it, I have to make sure that I do it. So, and therefore, since you have to make sure you pay him on time, you also have to make sure that if you haven't paid him at all, even after the fact, you have to make sure that you pay him. So from that standpoint, there would be an argument to be made that I should pay him the full 200 and then work after the fact on seeing if he ripped me off, I can take him to court. Od matzinu be'ahavas chesed shekasav lihistapek b'shem aprima gadim im nasan mos l'shliach sheyeshalim l'poel shelo bizmano im yuchal lismoch al zeh. The sefer from the Chafetz Chaim called Avas Chesed deals with the following situation. If I give payment to a proxy, and I tell, let's say, my foreman, please pay the workers on time, can I rely on my foreman to make sure that he's done the job? Can I rely on that, or do I have to verify that he paid the workers because we're dealing with a mitzvah deoraisa. So we see how far it goes, this halacha, that you really have to, even in cases of doubt, make sure that you err on the side of caution to make sure that a person gets paid his full wages at the proper time. However, so we have two conflicting issues here. On the one hand, when a person has not fixed the price in advance, I, as an employer, have a right to challenge that price. And if I can even find one person who's a professional who would be willing to take less, I'm entitled to pay you less. On the other hand, if I'm not certain, I can't withhold the wages from you based on my uncertainty whether you're entitled to. So those are two things to weigh. Ulam nira lanias daiti, the gam im ninkot ledina kedivrei ha'erach shai hanal, mikol makom ein linkot kein rak hecha shavadai nischayev lapoel litain schara. He says, but this halacha, that you have to, even in a case of suffix, pay him his wages, is only when it's been clear that you owe him that money. And it's only, let's say a suffix arises, did I pay you or did I not pay you? But what if there's a suffix, whether or not I was ever obligated to pay you that money? In other words, in the case of the Erech Shai, where you have to be machmir, it's where it's clear that at some point I was obligated to pay you. Now I'm not sure whether I've paid you or not. So then I have to be machmir. But in a case where it's not clear whether I ever owed you the money, because perhaps you're overcharging me, then kibenido didan bazelo amrin and safik torah hachmir. There we don't say that you have to be machmir. Kaven shesov sof hu inyan shalmama, because at the end of the day, it's a monetary dispute as to whether I owe you money or not. And I can prove that from a Mishnah in Maseches Bechoros that says, Dim yolda ishto zachar unekeva ein kan lekohen klum. Now, what's the halacha? If a man's wife gives birth to twins, a boy and a girl, so the question now is and we don't know which one was born first. Was the boy born first or the girl born first? If the boy was born first, then there needs to be a pidyon haben, and I need to give the kohen 5 shekels. If the girl was born first, then there's no mitzvah of pidyon haben. So in that situation, I don't have to give the kohen any money, even though there's a suffix de oraisa as to whether there needs to be a pidyon haben. He says, and the question is, why not? He says, so he quotes the Shulchan Aruch as saying, "The mishalo bachra ishto v'yolda zacher unekeva ve'ein yadua me'eza mehem yatzarishon ein kan lekohen klum." He says the kohen doesn't get anything because anytime there's a monetary dispute, we say hamotzi mechavero alav haraya. Whoever wishes to extract from the person who is the possessor of the money has the burden of proof. Even so, but it's a monetary suffix. It's a monetary suffix deoraisa. And any time there's a monetary suffix deoraisa, we revert back to amotza mechavero. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's the Torah says you owe 5 shekels to the kohen. Well, what if there's a suffix whether I owe 5 shekels? The kohen has to prove it. So someone has to prove it.
But then are you depriving your son of the mitzvah of pidyon haben? Or is it your mitzvah, I guess, but you're not getting it?
Look, if the child, when he gets older, or if I as a father want to do it misafik, I can, but I'm under no obligation because there's the burden of proof is on the extractor. Another example is Be'isha Sheina Yodas Imavia Yakoin Olevi O Yisrael. Benises Leish Behimlita Zachar Shuhu Peter Rechem La. Let's say here's another case of suffix. We know that if either parent is a Kohen or a Levi, the child is pater from a pidyon haben. What happens if the mother is a suffix, whether her father was a Kohen or a Levi or Israel? We don't know. So in that situation, and she gets married and she has a firstborn son. In that situation, the Pater Mipidyon Haben, the Tzemach Tzedek writes that that child also is exempt from Pidyon Haben. Da'af deruba da'almahem Yisraelim v'lo kohanim leviim. This is because even the majority of people are Yisraelim. Nonetheless, mikol makom ein holchem b'mamon achar harov ayin sham. He says, but we still don't go according to the majority when it comes to monetary issues. There's a little bit of a discussion over there that he raises in the parentheses, that maybe you should do a Pidyon Haben in that case. But the point that he's making is that the argument is that whenever there's a suffix mamon, even when it comes to doing a mitzvah, but the mitzvah itself involves monetary payment, we still say hamotzi mechaver olav haraya. Harei chazinun mizeh da'af demutal of mitzvahs asay deoraisa shel pidyon. Mikol makam hol ve'etzem hachiyuv eino vadai amrinan de'ein sarach l'kaima misafek. We still say that you don't have to fulfill that mitzvah. V'im kein hachanami b'nidon didan sheyesh safek im hu chayav lo bichlal sikum zeh shehu darish avur melachto. And therefore, in the case of over here, I don't know whether I owe you that money. I think you're ripping me off. And I have no evidence. You haven't brought me evidence that I owe you that money. I know for sure that this job has got to be worth at least 100 shekels. But for 200 shekels, that sounds exorbitant. And therefore, there's no evidence that I even ever owed you that money. Shuv ein bo chiyuv nesina shel b'yomo titein secharo. And therefore, it remains like any other suffix mamon, where I have a right to withhold payment until I verify that I actually owe you the money. And he gives another example by giving gifts that are owed according to the Torah to the Kohen, like truma and meiser and things like that. Owed nira. I'd like to also further argue. Diyesh lahochiach inyan zeh hadenechleku harishonim b'nedarim daf zayin iyesh yad lepeya v'litzdaka. He says, let me just see. What if there's a suffix? Let me just see. Whether I owe tzedakah, whether this field has had payah taken from it or left for the poor, or whether I owe money for tzedakah, whether or not there's a suffix whether I've made a pledge or not for tzedakah. The das haran sham the whole vihi ibai de lo ipshita sham besugya havale sveka de mamona ulakula. And the Ran says that whenever there's a doubt in monetary obligations, you're allowed to be lenient. And the Ran doesn't understand why the Ramban and the Rashba say that you have to be machmir over there. And therefore the Ran says whenever there's a suffix as to whether I owe tzedakah money to the poor, I'm allowed to be lenient. V'hamachane Ephraim Hilchos Nedarim Siman Ches Tiritz Kushas Aran al Ramban v'Rashba the shiny hacha da havi sveika b'nedarim the kaimelan b'ficha zu tzedakah v'habale yisura. And so one argument for why you should be machmir to defend the Ramban and the Rashba is because the Torah says that you have an obligation to fulfill your vows. So let's say there's a doubt whether I've actually made a pledge or not. So there's a suffix deoraisa on your pledge, and therefore by not fulfilling my pledge, I'm being over on an isser. The kain kasav ha'avnei nezer yoredeya, the suffix leket the leke elamamona sveka lakula of albaya dishmaitenu suffix isser lo yachel. The after beleket economy lavda lo silaket, chiluk yesh the beleket ulavda b'mamon umamon hedget nami ika lavda lo tigzol. He says that the Avnei Nezer writes a similar idea, whether if I'm not sure if I've done the mitzvah of leket, which is where if I drop things on the field, I have to leave them for the poor. Well, let's say I'm not sure whether this particular stalk of wheat was dropped or not. So he says, you're allowed to be makel and keep it for yourself because it's only a suffix mama. But he says the issue of whether or not I've made a pledge for tzedakah is an isser of lo yachel devaro, that you're not allowed to profane your words. Bikol makom sveiko lukula mashenkin lavda bal yachel hu af benadar mishvus sheina maman ankan devaro. Hare mevur midivrehem. So you see from what their words, the af sheika the leket lava asemin haTorah. What you see from here is that pledges are one thing, but when there's only a suffix mammon without a neder violation involved, such as did I leave for the poor? Is this designated for the poor, or am I allowed to take it for myself? We are therefore lenient. The only question is when it's a suffix whether I owe this money for tzedakah or not, that there's reason to be machmir because of a question whether that has the status of a neder. Od nirali lanias daiti lachazek hadavar upiska deleel mehadikasav b'shut Rabbi Eliezer Sasson dehecha the havi sveka the dina I havi ribis kitsutza. Okay, we're not going to get into that now. It's a little bit too complicated. He says al kain, just skipping. Lamaskana sa'inya nira lanias daiti barur odo sheila hanal de ein chiyov l'shalem leinstaltor rak et sikum shevadai magialo aval hachelek shehu safek ein bo iser baltolin bim lo nitan levarazos biyomo yuchal lashon la'achar kach la'achar habirur. Bottom line, if you feel that the guy's ripping you off and you want to, and you know for sure that you're willing to pay him X and he's charging you X plus Y, you have a right to pay him X and say, I'm not trying to shirk my duty of paying you on time, but I want to verify whether you're actually due this money or not. I want to do a little research to find out whether you're ripping me off or not. So give me another day. I need to make some calls. If you want, I'll pay you now what I believe I owe you, and then we'll talk tomorrow and I'll pay you the balance. That you are allowed to do according to halacha. Okay. Now the question is, of course, where do you get this expertise from to know that you feel that the guy's overcharging you? Well, it could be. There are certain instances where you could feel that you have a sufficient knowledge.